Welcome to Venture Node. We are a Web3 community of founders who are looking to learn from each other by speaking to people who are currently in the trenches of their own venture. My name is Adrian, and this is my co host Michael. Join us today with our guest coming from Naoris Protocol. Before we get into the episode, I would like to give a special thanks to DuckDAO for connecting us with our fascinating guest today. DuckDAO is a crypto incubator you can learn more about in the description of the episode. Let's start with introductions. David, can you tell us a bit about who you are?
Sure. So my name is David Carvalho. I am the CEO, chief scientist, and founder of Naoris Protocol. And my background has been as an ethical hacker for 22 years. And I've also been chief of security of various multi-billion dollar companies in various regulated spaces here in Europe and also in the UK. I also sit in various European boards, namely around smart cities, intelligence, and defense. And I advise various nation states and critical infrastructures on cyber war, cyber terrorism, and cyber espionage.
Awesome.
Okay.
So I noticed that your experience, you mentioned that you started at a very young age. I think you mentioned I think it was like 15 years old or something. So how did you start in cybersecurity at such a young age? What brought you towards that?
Yeah, it's a fun story. I'll try to make it short, but um, so there was no opportunity for you to have a real job, both as a kid and as a cybersecurity person when I was young. Um, so it was just myself and my neighbors actually getting into, undeleting stuff. And at the time, there was no name for it, but today it's called digital forensics. And eventually, it actually became something that we could be, doing just to get some money to build our next machine or to get our faster internet connection during the time of 56K modems. Um, and it just kind of like developed into a passion. It's something that I've always been doing, besides, both my school and the sports that I was doing when I was younger. I started when I was 13. I fortunately got access through some colleagues to a number of, kind of like fun stuff, basically, Trojans and small pieces of malware in their open source code. And we decided to start playing with that and playing with some forensics tool at the time that were quite limited, but still allowed us to do a bunch of kind of like freelance work, really. And I don't know if I should say this, but at the time it wasn't necessarily a felony or bad to spam anything. It was just sending a lot of mails. So we spammed the hell out of Europe to try and get forensic jobs on companies, saying, hey, we know we can do this, we can undelete your data, you can access, files that were potentially deleted, taken out of the hard drive to a format or whatever, because the files actually stay there if you don't forcibly format the hard drive, just the headers disappear. So you can still potentially get access to the data. And eventually we start getting answers, 6 months later or whatever from companies saying, hey, this is going on, that's going on. We need your help with this, with that investigation. So slowly that led into both myself and some other friends that then ended up creating various ethical hacking groups, both in Portugal and Brazil, to start, joining various investigations together, sometimes with law enforcement arms, other times just internal company investigations around, malpractice, malfeasance, malicious behavior, corruption, all sorts. Um, and yeah, that's been kind of like the path that we took initially. But um, it was fun because, well, the internet was too slow. You couldn't really download big pieces of data. So we were really getting, hard drives by mail, snail mail from other countries, um, and small blades of servers and stuff like that. So yeah, we had a lot of fun, and this lasted for a number of years, and it really pushed our knowledge up forcibly. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. I know that cybersecurity is it requires like a very broad understanding of either the IT or the blockchain space as a whole, right? Unlike other positions where they they require a high level of specialization, right? So I guess my question would be, how did your experience working at other companies such as OCS and London City Airport, like, what did you gain from working at those companies? And yeah,
Right.
how did that eventually lead you to where you are now?
Well, it's kind of like a long story, but I'll make it simple.
Yeah,
But
sure.
before that, I was in AT&T and I was in other places. So I actually these were completely different positions.
Yep.
So, for example, in London City Airport and OCS, I was the global chief of security. So I was in charge of all security teams, everything from penetration testing, best practice enforcement, rules and regulations, you name it, both physical and logical, right? Across the business globally. But having said that, this doesn't come in a vacuum, as you were saying. So I guess from the beginning, I was, fortunate and unfortunate. Like as I was saying before, like the only reason why I really got into cyber was because my 486 computer when I was very young was too slow to play games. So I had to do something else to keep busy. And that led to all the things that I mentioned before. And then just a number of things kept happening that, they were fortuitous, but they led to, just getting deeper and deeper into that space where there wasn't a lot of, professionals in the space at the time. If you were working in cyber, you were either working, for an agency and you had a real job, or you were working for a company where you're maybe the only guy doing this, and this company was probably a multi-billion-dollar company that was forced because of some regulatory thing to have a guy. But generally, this person wasn't necessarily making much of a difference because leadership was not focused on that in general.
Mm.
So having said that, the background that I have built over time, myself and my peers, was very focused on Linux capability, on cryptographic capability. Obviously, crypto comes from cyber. It's one of the domains of cybersecurity. It's cryptography. Um, and other capabilities that allow us to just not just build things, break things, and test things across operating systems, right? So maintaining and managing, cloud systems, creating your own, a lot of trial and error all the time. How can I say, the information in this space, on the cybersecurity space, was not democratized as it is today. So you just needed to know a guy that knew a guy. And right now you can go anywhere on the internet and you can get like video tutorials, which is awesome, man. It's amazing.
Yeah.
But it's a different world completely. But having said that, my background in cyber really helped with the natural approach. Cyber and system administration in general in complex environments really helped with both on the cyber side and on the blockchain side, because so in blockchain, for example, for you to set up nodes and stuff like that, you need to have some decent knowledge of Linux. You need to have some decent knowledge of network administration, system administration, and so all of that helps. And so you can test stuff, play with stuff. But then on the cyber side, you also all these things actually come together. They don't live in a vacuum. Um, on the cyber side, it was actually a collection from penetration testing capabilities and experience mixed with a lot of trial and error during back in the day. That just allows you, or myself, to be chief of security and actually know why things are happening, why risks are present, and what are the alternatives to fix them, so you can make informed decisions because you know the tech stuff. So all of that really came together to create this opportunity. Myself also, I was a miner for a while. So I was one of the largest miners in Europe, I believe, from a proof of stake perspective between 2013 and 2015, or 2016, mainly on the Dash space and other, derivatives of it, which there were, at the time, up to 2017, like hundreds.
Mm.
Then they were all based on the same thing. You basically had to build master nodes, help anonymize transactions and move on, right?
That's really
And
interesting.
profit.
And I think you mentioned too, so you were kind of mentioning that there seemed to be at these earlier stages kind of an underinvestment in cybersecurity, and maybe you kind of felt like you were trying to put a lot of effort into these companies, but maybe the upper management wasn't taking
Yeah,
cybersecurity as seriously as maybe you would have liked.
yeah.
So from your experience in the cybersecurity industry, like what issues did you see, and like how, and are they still prevalent today, or would you say that the narrative is starting to shift in regards to cybersecurity?
No, that's an awesome question. And I just want to make sure that I don't piss anybody off from my previous employers. Like, to tell the truth, like in terms of leadership, I always joined businesses that I wanted to, build things. I wanted to build the teams. I wanted to build a practice, create an information security management system within the company, create culture around it. So I never really wanted to go to environments that were extremely cyber mature because they're just kind of like boring. That was just management. Right? And so I was fortunate enough to go to environments where they were growing, they were complex, and going back into the risks and threats and the vulnerabilities that exist in all these environments. I don't think that there was or there is any fundamental change on how these things are approached now. I think the only thing that happens now is that the risk is much more transparent than there was before. And also there are like the regulatory hammer, it's much high, it's much bigger and much thicker and more painful than was before, if there was any, right? So companies now are generally aware of their risks in a way that they weren't before. But that's not to say that the risks have gone away. If anything, they have actually become bigger because, as I mentioned before, cybersecurity has become more democratized, both in the defender side and on the attacker side. But on the attacker side, I would say it's probably orders of magnitude more developed than on the defender side. And this is a massive issue because if you have a complex organization that distributed around the world, maybe a regulated space like banking or whatever, or healthcare, you have massive amounts of information that are very valuable that sit on your systems, and that makes you a natural target because of two reasons. One of them is it's very complex for you to manage all your environment and make sure that every single device is actually up to standards and following best practice, and every person is, etc., and there's all the patching is done, and there's no standing vulnerabilities and no standing risks on the system, so on and so forth. And at the same time, you hold very important data that has a lot of value in the deep web. So not to speak about your IP, right? Because if there's like, for example, if you're a regulated company in industry area or in banking or whatever, there's a high probability that your adversaries are not just hackers or criminal organizations that might be well backed, but actually nation states trying to steal your intellectual property, right? So now we enter the spaces of like forceful data exfiltration and cybercrime in the context of cyber espionage.
Okay.
So
And I think that
yeah,
ties
so
in perfectly with like current day events as well. I know you mentioned that this could be something that would be interesting to cover. Is like with the Russian Ukraine war right now. I think the topic of cybersecurity and nation states is definitely on the top of a lot of people's minds, especially like with the U.S. You could say like the cyber war that they kind of declared on Russia once they started to invade Ukraine, with things like blocking access to SWIFT, or other methods. So I think, yeah, I mean, like, how would you say cybersecurity ties into like the current day issues, especially with the Russia Ukraine war?
yeah, it's impossible to separate any digital system or service or operations from cybersecurity. Like without cybersecurity or trust as a baseline, you're really gambling. There's no, you cannot maintain a business over time. Your reputation is going to get damaged. You're going to lose business. You're going to lose capability to offer, fundamental things for society at critical infrastructure level, right? And those tend to be like the targets of cyber war, cyber terrorism, and cyber espionage in general. So all the things that I mentioned before, all the sorts of risks that I mentioned before, and the difficulty and also the appetite for an attacker, difficulty to defend and appetite for an attacker to attack, they all converge into kind of like what we call surface of risk. So the more complexity you have on a system, the more devices you have, the more surface of risk there are. And all these devices are potential points of entry or points of failure for the systems they sit on. So it makes sense. And the whole approach that you're having right now in the context of your question towards, the Ukraine situation and other situations that keep on occurring across the world in a daily basis, from an IP theft perspective, from a cyber war perspective, or even just kind of like putting fully undetectable pieces of malware into critical infrastructure. In the case in the future, if there is a conflict, you have a button and you can press the button and you can disable critical infrastructure, or a nuclear power station, or an exchange or whatever, right? At nation state level, all these are real threats that currently don't have, the solutions for them are, well, they are centralized, and there's a lot of problems with that, because that actually, just continues the traditional problem of central points of failure. So your cybersecurity provider is also kind of like a point of failure towards you. And you
Okay.
also don't know what they're doing, right? So they are black box. You don't really know. You just hope that they're fine. And it's a very interesting thing, because myself as a chief of security, and every chief of security thinks, okay, I'm going to mitigate risk by putting this tool here, but it's a black box, and I'm putting it in the middle of my environment, and you don't really you trust it to a point, but they have their own pressures, maybe from the country they're in, and they have their own agendas. And it has happened in the past that they themselves are the point of failure towards your infrastructure, right? But going a little bit back into your question in the context of cyber war that we're going through today, um, a distributed approach to cybersecurity just makes sense, because under this complexity, it adds another layer on the what we call cybersecurity stack defense model, which is it's a defense in depth principle, where the more layers you have, the better, right? You have a network layer, you have defense locally with antivirus and so on. And then you have another layer, which in our case, we are the cybersecurity mesh, a distributed cybersecurity mesh, that we add a distributed layer on top of anything that's there. And it doesn't matter if the process that's running is, a cybersecurity process or an operational thing, that just, everything needs to be validated, but from a distributed perspective. So in other words, your complexity that was, basically mirroring your risk before, right now, or under this principle, acts pretty much as a distributed source of validation for you. So every device is a point of strength instead of a point of failure. So they all, as nodes, they all act as watchdogs of each other, right? So the way of how you, as an institution or a country or a regulator, think about cybersecurity is in how you implement it is completely different from that perspective. Now, we're not substituting anything, and we are not actually competing with the traditional tools. They are still there and they're doing their job. What we are is actually another layer of resilience and security on a world that currently is just centralized from that perspective. And this allows to mitigate potentially, according to Gartner, which is a trend setter in the world, cybersecurity meshes, they believe in the next 5-10 years are going to be generally used by all sorts of businesses and mitigate up to 80-90% of threats. Because believe it or not, the vast majority, and I mean like 80-90% of threats actually come from the fact that you have a very complex environment. It's very easy for you to forget patching here or there, or not have to factor enable here or there, or not having an antivirus here or there, etc., or having a standing vulnerability that you don't know about. So if you have a general enforcement of the cybersecurity standards across your organization in a distributed way, that's also learning from other threats that might occur in other organizations in a peer-to-peer format, regardless of the network, which is something that blockchains are obviously not really made to do. It's like current blockchains were made for this objective, right? So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, how did you make the first leap into the blockchain industry, and Yeah, how did you first find out about the technology? And yeah, how do you think that blockchain technologies can offer additional security features when compared to traditional systems?
So I'll try to answer all the questions. If I forget any, just remind me.
Yeah, sure.
But how I entered the space was really as a miner. Obviously, I was already interested in the whole notion of distributed network capability in a peer-to-peer basis, not just as an avid torrent user, but also from other perspectives that were more related to enterprise use cases or academic use cases. So as a miner, it just made sense to me that certain transactions would be distributed, validated, or validated in a distributed manner. And then once Ethereum appeared, then you could actually use smart contracts, etc. Um, you know that started creating some other thoughts that were very much aligned with what we ended up building. And even before we joined all the accelerators that we joined, and got all the validation from traditional businesses, from Cisco to banks and family offices, etc., in saying, yeah, this makes sense. We want to use something like this. But so the first time that I actually got involved in blockchain in some way was actually a long time ago. So I think the Bitcoin was below $1, and you could still mine with CPUs.
Mhm.
um, so that's actually what I was doing, and I had a bit of fun doing it. And I continued on that path for a while, just increasing capability. But what really pushed me into the space was something that I saw as a natural opportunity to bring the space where I was active, which was cybersecurity, and the decentralized nature of blockchain, right? Because cybersecurity has always been a space that's very centralized by its own nature. Like all the vendors, they don't share information with each other. They are centralized in all sorts of ways, right? And it would make sense to decentralize this, not just from a perspective of like allowing for threat intelligence to be shared around, but also to allow for validations of truth and trust, and which is basically what happens, in the blockchain normally. But if we could extend that to systems, right, and running processes and networks and best practice enforcement through the chain, then that I believed it would fundamentally change the space. And eventually, there was a meeting that I had actually in Oslo, Norway, number of years ago. This was 2017, 2018, um, sometime around then, where there was the former chief of intelligence of NATO also on the meeting, and various other people that were related also to nation state critical infrastructure, where the idea just came up, hey, why don't we use, for example, blockchain and smart contracts to apply to some of these risks and minimize the threats that exist in some networks that could be points of failure to other networks, from a risk management perspective, from a standards enforcement perspective, all the way to finding actually potential direct threats on the systems and on the processes. Early on, that as a thought was very captivating to me. So I started going into conferences and speaking to people and regulators and so on, and saying, "Hey, is this something that makes sense?" And, in the beginning, they thought, whatever I'm saying, they didn't even know what blockchain was, right? So blockchain plus cyber, they are not two concepts that are easy. So bringing them together was a bit complicated, but over time, it just became obvious also as they understood more what the blockchain was, etc., that it made sense to go on that direction. And then we passed from the ideation phase into actually getting into development and joining all the accelerators, some of the top accelerators in the world, and being finalists on them and winning some of them as well, in the middle of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of other companies of all kinds, right? So yeah, all of these pushed us to the place where we are in today. And I'm not sure if I answered all your questions, Michael. So
Yeah, yeah.
please.
Yeah, you answered them pretty well.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think you went over the I guess the industry as a whole. I guess the next best question would be, um, specifically in the blockchain space, what separates like a well-seasoned programmer that can create, high quality, secure contracts versus just a general programmer that maybe enters into Solidity and starts deploying contracts without maybe they're self-taught, maybe they learn programming on YouTube or on a web course somewhere, or maybe they don't have a computer science degree. Is there some kind of certification that maybe separates the two, or some kind of skill that separates these two kind of programmers within the blockchain space?
I would say so,
Yeah,
because a programmer that is actually more senior, quote quote,
yeah,
and it doesn't need to be senior as in older. It's just like has more experience from like an enterprise standpoint. They know a lot about vulnerabilities that come from just code itself, um, and how that can impact infrastructures. There's a lot of side channel attacks that can come from code exploitation. Obviously, smart contracts being exploited, it's something that was going to happen. Like on blockchain, is you write code and the code's available. It's online. Like anybody can
yeah,
review it, and if there's a problem, it's not like you can hide that problem. Like it's going to be potentially exploited in a way that's pretty malicious and impactful, right? So you're kind of like asking for it to happen. But currently there isn't any enforcement of standards on that side. I mean, there's some efforts, but they are, I think, very limited. In the blockchains where you implement stuff, be it on Ethereum or wherever, um, where you implement and set up your smart contracts, it doesn't matter if you're implementing it on Ethereum or on Polygon or whatever. You're doing it probably in different places, mainly for cost reasons. You're not necessarily doing it because you want it to be more secure or for it to be validated and give it, for example, an overall score of risk. And most times people obviously borrow code from somewhere else, and maybe it's from a different version of code that, there's a vulnerability associated with it or an exploit is associated with that piece of code. And if there is a workaround, it's not transparent, you don't know about it. And there isn't any alert or block that prevents you to put that smart contract up. And there's no, for example, CWEs that we have, for example, for vulnerabilities in traditional systems. In that environment, there's also potentially no solution to the problem that you don't know you have. So there's a number of things that we try to bring in to potentially help those environments. So let me explain a little bit why and how. So I want to make first a mirror between, or a bridge between Web 2 and Web 3 world. So the Web 3 world is everything that we know, from, exchanges, centralized, decentralized to a point, from, everything that's blockchains, layer one, layer twos, bridges, so on and so on, right? And by its own nature, they already have a number of security principles and standards that are enforced by definition in design and default by the chain, right? But then there are problems with vulnerabilities in code, right? Which is something that you can't necessarily escape, right? And then there are other vulnerabilities that even lower on the code potentially that can be disasters for a chain, right? But if we go a little bit back, you need to understand that both as a developer and as a system administrator and a project owner or a CEO or whatever, you need to understand that whatever it is that you have, everything is running on traditional systems. So your blockchain, all the nodes, the validators, the what have you, everything is still running on, maybe systems in the cloud, in Amazon, in Azure, whatever, that are traditional servers running traditional operating systems managed by traditional humans, right? So all the risks that are there actually they are inherited by the chain, regardless if you know it or not. And those risks can lead to, a huge amount of problems, right? I mean, everything from, you know, you having vulnerabilities on your environment that is, for example, you have a breach and you have vulnerabilities there, and that leads that to be exploited. Vulnerabilities on the validators themselves, like, validators be validating, right? That's what validators do. But you currently don't really have any checks on, besides uptime, in like, are you available to validate? And what we need really is a different standard or approach to this, where the validators are actually trusted by design and default. So that they don't have any standing vulnerabilities. They are not currently hacked. They don't have, a known piece of malware running. They don't, they're following best practice, and they don't have like open services to the internet, et cetera, et cetera. So because, or somebody's, I don't know, increasing their accesses in a way that they shouldn't, in order to create a smart contract that would be, potentially malicious, or creating a DOS or DDoS attack against like a smaller shard or a smaller side chain that would lead to a 51% attack. Or there's an advanced persistent threat risk on any other system that is critical to what you're doing. So all of these things, and there are so many risks actually traditionally that are not cared for and not necessarily enforced, that end up being a risk to the blockchain itself and the survivability of the blockchain, or the, creating side channel attacks, everything from Sybil attacks to 51% attacks, or any other problem like that. So that's one side, and we cover that side also. So we pretty much bring decentralization from a baseline of trust and security to these traditional systems that are still, 99.9% of the world is built on this, right? And in blockchains are running on top of it, right? Be it on the cloud or on premise or whatever. And then there's the other side that's very related to your question, right? But I wanted to go there first, because this is what's at the baseline, and then everything is built on top of it. And if you have risks at baseline, they are inherited, right? So what we want is to mitigate risks at baseline, and then start mitigating at the other layers until the point where you're actually developing and putting code in Solidity or whatever. So at that point, and that's something we want to do as well on that side, is allow, and again, we are not competing with traditional cybersecurity tools. We are a different layer. And we're also not competing with general purpose blockchains, because our blockchain is not general purpose. Our blockchain is on top of EVM, and the purpose is cybersecurity and cyber trust enforcement, right? So we are not doing general purpose transactions there, but also under our dedicated consensus mechanism that is also separated. All of that happens together in order to allow, for example, somebody to deploy, for example, a smart contract, if they want to, using, for example, Solidity, into our chain, and enforce that both the validators are okay and they are trusted. They are not just, putting potentially bad data into the chain, or a bad smart contract or whatever, all the way to, so taking care of your infrastructure on the traditional side, servers, management, so on, all the way to, okay, you put the smart contract on our chain, we are going to get that validated from a perspective of like, okay, detect if, give it an overall score of trust. Like, is this code borrowed from somewhere else? Can we see it? Like, and then we get intelligence from a bunch of open and closed sources in regards to, smart contract potentially malicious, both behaviors and correlated issues that could lead to exploits, all the way to giving you the workarounds or the solutions and alert you before you actually deploy the code, right? And these, we believe that it's really currently missing everywhere. So this is kind of like our big transformatory or transformation pledge to the space on the Web3 side, also with the natural bridge between, because most of Web3 tools are actually for the world of Web3 in our case, but that's still like, a small percentage of the world, right? Of the world economy, etc. Huge potential of growth, and I believe 100% on it. But what we're doing is both for that world and for the other 99.9% of the world that still needs to be convinced that Web3 is the way. So maybe if we ensure trust, security, baseline enforcement of, of standards that leads to more security and more overall assurance, of data, of services across the world through Web3 methods on Web2 spaces, that's probably the way to go.
And I think that's a perfect segue to dive a little deeper into the Naoris protocol itself. I know the Naoris protocol, like you mentioned, is not trying to compete with like traditional smart contract blockchains. But I did notice that Naoris has an extremely high throughput. I think the number of transactions per second was extremely high that it mentioned in the white paper and on the website. And part of that is also through sharding. But I was
Yes.
wondering what your thoughts were on the blockchain scalability trilemma in terms of speed versus security and scalability. Like, do you see that as a potential like threat if Norris is going to target like such high transaction throughputs? Or what are your thoughts on the scalability trilemma?
So that's a very good question. So on the side of throughputs, again, we are not competing with other chains. We're not saying, okay, we have faster throughputs, transactions per second, whatever. And also, we are not using as complex potential, smart contracts as they are. We're also not probably going to be using any bridges and things like this that they are that add complexity to everything. So the way that our chain operates is between our daemon that lives on the systems and understands if they have like a threat there, if everything is being followed towards on the direction of like the standards that are defined for that shard, if you want to call it. We call them verge clusters. A verge cluster is basically like a shard, but a shard that has a bunch of like mitigated risks by default and design, right? Because all the validators that are on it or the participants are known to be secure before they even can join the shard. So you as a node, you don't just need to stake something to do something or to have a daemon there that allows you to validate something. You actually need to be proven to be safe, not to have any, known threat running, to not have any known vulnerability available, etc., for you to actually be allowed to onboard into that quote quote shard, right? So this mitigates a lot of other risks that exist on that shard. The validations that we do are also done, in parallel as well, as you mentioned. So we can achieve such throughputs, but the validations happen very much focused from a perspective of minimization and minimization of data. So, for example, the proof that the system is secure or trusted with all its running processes and the best practice enforcement principles that would be existing on that specific shard or virtual cluster are all basically put into a 32-byte key that's shared and that's validated by other validators. It's inside and outside of this specific virtual cluster or shard. So the complexity of validation compared to traditional smart contracts that you see in a general purpose blockchain is lower because we're actually validating different things. Right? We're validating things from a trust perspective, from a truth perspective only, associated with a lot of other intelligence that happens in the background from a cybersecurity perspective. But that's on the daemon side. And then the consensus mechanism, which is a modified proof of stake consensus, it's called DPoS, distributed proof of security, connects directly with the daemon that's on the system and uniquely identifies both the processes that are running, the principles that the system is following, and the system itself to mitigate other problems, like other side channel attacks also towards that virtual cluster or shard in that specific system. So all of these actually comes together not in a vacuum, but actually also at various layers, so that you can ensure such things. And the transactions are very light. I guess that's my answer to that. At the same time, I would add that since we're talking about like our project and the protocol, the reason why we went for a separate blockchain is really for the purpose of cybersecurity. It's best practice in enterprise or regulatory spaces or regulated spaces that you need to be as air-gapped and separated from any other processes or general purpose thing as you can for this purpose. Because the use case is too critical to be in a general purpose blockchain. And just imagine, like, this is kind of like an anecdote, but imagine we're protecting a nuclear power station management system that's connected to all the SCADA systems that are basically little chips that measure like the temperature and the pressure on the nuclear core and stuff like that. And obviously, it's a very high criticality thing to validate such things, right? Now, imagine that we were using a general purpose blockchain and it doesn't make sense for us to wait for an NFT of a cat video to be processed before we actually validate if the nuclear power station is safe. Right? So that associated with our dedicated consensus model allows us to create, pretty much a machine economy where all of these systems operate in unison across networks under a peer-to-peer system, validating each other from a trust perspective in a simple way that can be fast and efficient, but yet highly secure and using zero knowledge proofs, ZK snarks, so that even internal threats, like in terms of like, or any other observers, or if you actually own a big part of that network, you can, it's very hard for you to change the source of truth of this, because you can actually validate the trust status of a system, but you don't know which system it is, and you don't know where it is or who it belongs to. But you can still cryptographically validate if that's acceptable, whatever's happening there, right? And that's really the objective of our chain. So we look at it more of like as a hyperstructure, and this is actually a name that we borrowed from someone else, and we find that that name really embodies our objectives, which is, we want to make it, minimally extractive. Only the transaction costs are the only costs. There's no cost for implementation. You can join a virtual cluster or create your own without any cost. The system is unstoppable. So as long as you have two nodes, you can shut it down. Unless you are the owner of the virtual cluster, in which case you can actually shut it down. But as the rest of the system is built to be just working forever, and other principles that are fundamental to this is the win-win principle, where we are not competing with any other chain out there. We act more of like a utility, right? So anybody can use us alongside anything else, including other blockchains or no blockchains at all. And we are there to help and increase your overall baseline trust on everything that you're doing and providing to others, right? And any other parties that join benefit from the intelligence that you're providing the chain from a threat management perspective, and they benefit from you too validating them. So it's a win-win situation, right? And that was the ethos for us to go ahead and create this. Yeah.
So I noticed that you did mention that you can use it either with a blockchain or without one. So if someone does want to implement something like this into maybe like an Ethereum contract, how does it tie into that contract? Like maybe you can give an example of a specific contract and then the use case of how this cybersecurity mesh will interact with the contract, if that makes
Right.
sense.
So
Like
imagine an NFT. Yeah.
how's it tie into the contract, I guess?
Yeah. So imagine an NFT, right? That
Yeah.
would normally run on Ethereum
Yeah.
and potentially could be, let's say that NFT was going to be used in some metaverse platform or whatever.
Yeah.
That NFT might have a bunch of issues. Like from a code perspective, it might be using like, old code that was borrowed from someone else, and there's already known vulnerabilities for that code, etc. So once that is actually put through our kind of like, we call it like our pane of glass, let's say, you basically put it there, and before it's deployed, you receive a bunch of intelligence about it. And that's what happens. So you put it there before it actually goes into our chain that obviously has all these baseline validations that are different than normal. I guess they are very focused on cyber and risk mitigation principles. The deployment would actually be very similar to from a deployment perspective, if you were to deploy it, say, for example, on Polygon, right? But you would have, before you deploy it, a bunch of capability to check things like vulnerabilities, do basically a code audit, let's say, composition analysis on the smart contract if it was more complex, and tell you that whatever your life cycle to get into the contract, or if it actually connects to other contracts, etc. If there was any risk existing there and what kind of risk that was. It would also give you a rating from 0 to 10 on the potential risk that because you might want to do something that's potentially risky, like going through a bridge or something like that that's not direct, right, for DeFi or whatever. And you want to accept some risk, right? So let's say that, oh, you won't, say, for example, a 10 is extremely risky and a 0, there's no risk, right? So you're okay with, a 3, right? So yeah, fine, I already mitigated all the other risks outside of there. I know that, like, my code, I have the latest version of this code under this library, or under this algo or whatever. Yeah, I'm going to deploy that. Yes, I need to use a bridge. I'm okay with that. I'm going to do it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have anything, unless there's obviously some validations for this at currently at low level, but they are very well, they are not very accurate. They are not super actionable because they don't tell you what's the workaround or what's the solution or so on. And they are not necessarily automated either. In our case, they are automated. Like, before the thing goes up, you actually know what's going on.
Yeah, and as you talk about like Ethereum and smart contracts, like I wonder what your views are on the security of different smart contract programming languages, in terms of, like, do you see a huge security advantage to functional languages, such as Haskell, when compared to object-oriented languages such as Solidity? And also, I believe for the chain that you guys are building, it would be based on like WebAssembly or smart contracts, or I may be incorrect. So, what are your views on like the security of different smart contract programming languages?
Yeah, they're built on smart contracts. So yeah, my view on those, I would say it doesn't. So from a baseline principle, I would say that just the traditional smart contract approach that exists, for example, in Ethereum, is probably the most audited piece of code ever. But at the same time, this is not really being used properly. And there are no ISACs. There is no intelligence sharing capability in general, in an easy way between either communities or closed or open source, let's say. So you actually need to go and dig, and dig deep to actually find solutions to potential code issues. But to tell the truth, it's almost irrelevant what kind of like language you're going to use in terms of actually existing problems, because you're going to face the same problems that I'm describing here. Like, you need, let's speak. Actually, I'm going to speak from a perspective of like a mature, traditional enterprise approach to code, right? You want to test locally, and you want to know a bunch of problems that are potentially baseline or intermediate, not too complex, before you deploy in any way. But on chain, that's not really possible. Like, your environment for testing, yeah, sure, it's there, but you still don't know. You're only going to get into the wolves, let's say, in a beta state, uh, once you put your code online. Um, and regardless of whatever language you have, I would say, you really need to implement security principles into your SDLC. So you basically need to create principles that have a checklist there from a vulnerability management perspective, that allows you to just deal with detection of problems in your open source code, because the higher probability is that there is some source of intelligence somewhere that says that your code is probably not good here or there, and and the chances are you don't know about it. So from a perspective of software composition, which in the end the smart contract is, it's a DApp, right? Or some form of it, or a bit of it. You need to have these best practices brought in from the traditional world in some fashion into the blockchain world. And I find that it's easy to have risk because there is no transparency here. It's easy to be a cowboy even if you don't want to be a cowboy, right? So I believe that an approach to mitigate this risk is going to benefit the whole community.
Yep, I see. Yeah, so it sounds like there's just a constant race, I guess, between innovation on the attackers and the defenders side, right? So I
Yeah.
guess so yeah, I'd like to ask, how does AI play into the security risks of cybersecurity and maybe blockchain as well? Because yeah, you would assume that on the defender's side, if they're a established protocol company with a lot of money on the line or a reputation, that they would invest in a large amount of talent, right?
Yeah.
To always kind of keep up with the attackers. And yeah,
Yeah.
I know AI with every passing day is becoming more powerful and powerful. So how does that play into the equation here?
Yeah, so in terms of code analysis, definitely AI has a role. In terms of like code penetration testing as well. In terms of, and that's true. It has been true in the traditional world for a while, and it will be true, regardless if it's us doing it or someone else on the blockchain side as well. So you were mentioning the attacker versus the defender, and currently it's completely unfair on the side of the defender. Sure, you can get the best talent to mitigate risk, but the thing is, you need to fix or know about every single potentially infinite problem that you're going to have in a piece of code. And the attacker just needs to find one problem, and you need to find infinite problems. So this is not fair, right? You're also having a small amount of people, right? And if your code is up, you're basically putting your code available to be pen tested live by the world, right? So you're basically saying, you know, I built this with really five really capable people, but I'm putting this available for what is basically a pen test by tens of thousands of quite capable people as well, and many others that are not, right? But still, people can, there have been a lot of breaches of smart contracts, and not only through mistakes, like people didn't know even that that was a problem or that could be a problem. It just kind of happened. And a lot of this happened also in DeFi, where a guy is like playing around between bridges and suddenly there's something that is not supposed to do that happens. And then it just carries on doing it, right? So I can go a little bit deeper on the AI side on the regarding cybersecurity as well. So AI is going to play and has played a massive role in cybersecurity. Not necessarily from an attacker's perspective, which is kind of ironic, but mainly from a defender's perspective. Even though the attacking versus defending side is completely tilted towards the side of the attacker for the reasons that I mentioned before and many others, um, they have a massive advantage. The defender side now has access to a different layer of defense, which is distributed, which leverages their complexity and their existing infrastructure, not for risk, but for defense. And at the same time, or with our architectural approach, but at the same time, it allows for the creation of different approaches to risk management in the traditional world, like in the Web 2 world, that are backed by AI where it wasn't possible before. So traditionally, you could look at something like maybe behavior analysis using AI. So if something is actually known to be malicious, and there's something similar to that, then there is a probability that that's malicious, right? But now, with what we call, for example, swarm AI, which is a Bayesian AI system that it's distributed in nature, you can actually correlate AI biases and weights in a way that are potentially related to a threat that's actually developing because most people don't know this, but most hacks for them to be successful are like, but of course there's a long time maybe of scouting, etc., but for them to actually happen, it takes like 5 minutes. But it takes a very, very long time to actually make them have a large impact on an organization, be whatever organization that may be. So for example, if it's a ransomware, first you attack one system, you spread around the network, you eventually find all their accesses and you find all their cloud backups and so on. And yeah, it takes maybe a year to do this. And then you ransom everything together. Otherwise, you just be ransoming 4 or 5 systems that are already with backups and you don't make any money, right? Because they just restore them. So it takes a long time to do this. And this traditionally is not possible to correlate from a behavior perspective. But if all the systems actually have nodes on them, you can actually correlate with an AI between them and understand that this system that's behaving kind of weird, then the ones that are connected on network to it are also starting to become weird, and so on, right? So you can actually mitigate such threats potentially in much shorter spaces. And I'm going to tell you something most people don't know, but the time to detection of a breach currently is 280 days in average. So if you're an attacker, you have 280 days to live off the land, exfiltrate data, whatever,
Wow.
in average, before you are detected. So you literally can do anything that your imagination or capability allows you to do. So that's why you end up with, massive breaches that lead to, for example, SolarWinds hack in the US that led to 40,000 companies being hacked eventually through, for example, a service provider, right? That had malicious code that was injected inside and nobody knew about it, so on and so forth. Or other breaches that stop critical infrastructure, like happened in Ukraine, like hundreds of thousands of people or millions of people without electricity, etc., etc. And this is going to continue to happen, right? So the point is, if you find these very early, maybe you just need to fix 1 or 2 systems, right? But if the status quo that we have right now continues, you only find this when your business is on its knees and like everything is back to the Stone Age and everything is encrypted, and encryption is almost mathematically perfect, and there's no way you're going to get anything back unless you pay some guys that are going to do the same to you again because you paid them, right? So yeah, so the potential for bringing some balance to the force in terms between defenders and attackers, both through AI together with blockchain, is huge. And myself and people in this space that understand the risks to their organizations and even governments see this as the next logical step.
I think that perfectly ties into blockchain, and it definitely makes sense why that would be the next step. But I mean, going back to Norris, I also noticed that like there will be a token, and that's going to be part of the whole like
Yeah.
node process as well, and it's the cyber token. So I was wondering, like, at what stage are you all at in your launch process, and like, what's the plan for the cyber token?
Right. So on the process of the company, let's say, or the business, we went through a number of things that are not traditional or common in the they're common in cybersecurity world, but they're not common on the blockchain world, but they're in both. So we went through a number of accelerators. As I mentioned, we had really big enterprises, global enterprises, and critical infrastructure review what we had, um, you know, some proof of concepts, et cetera, et cetera. And now we are in a phase that we are ready to push out the rest of the development of the in live, let's say, putting live the protocol itself that is, the shoulders where everything runs. Um, and on that context, the Naoris protocol is currently on one of their private sales, so it's currently private. People can go to our Telegram on our website or whatever, and ask about this, and they can get involved, either both as supporting the project in various ways from working with us. We can hire people, and we're hiring very aggressively, everything from cybersecurity professionals to blockchain professionals, cryptographers, PhDs, so on. Also from a business development perspective, from a KOL perspective, and even as a partner as well. So anything from traditional businesses to exchanges and other chains or bridges or what have you are welcome to come and talk to us. And yeah, onwards and upwards.
What's your grand vision for Norris? Where do you see your Norris in 1 year from now, and then in 5 years from now? Do you see it as maybe becoming the standard for on-chain cybersecurity potentially, or yeah, how do you see that?
Well, that's a very good question. Always being a futurist is always a job it's very hard to keep. So I'll try to not go too deep on that, but I can tell you that this is a best effort on our side on something that we passionately believe is something that makes sense not just from an enterprise world and traditional world, but also chain world, to minimize risk and mitigate risk across all the operations that are possible now and are going to be possible in the future from the Web3 side and also from the Web2 side, and hopefully bring them together. So hopefully we see ourselves as the bridge in the next year, next 2 years between wallets and Web3 services and enforcement of best practice across devices that you might not necessarily have access to, but you still want to make sure that people are not being hacked when they use their wallet and things like this, all the way to just general operational stuff. In 5 years, hopefully based on the principle that we are also following, that is the Gartner's trend of cybersecurity mesh, that is what we are. We hope in the next 5 years for it to be a standard. It makes sense for it to be a standard in some fashion by that time. And hopefully that will mitigate the kind of threats that we have today that tend to be, like I mentioned, extremely sticky. Regardless of how much money we spend, the threats or the amount of threats just keep going up. And we are looking at a world in 2025 where we're going to have probably $10 trillion a year loss to cyber problems, cyber threats. And that's, if you're asking how much is that, it's about 6-7% of the global economy, right? And that's not sustainable. Like, so if we could use that in, even if it was an order of magnitude less in, say, I don't know, humanitarian causes or whatever, it would fundamentally change the world that we have. So I think it's a well worth it task for myself and my team to continue to push. And yeah, that's what we're going to do.
I mean, you mentioned going to conferences, meeting with different incubators, and just really trying to flesh out your idea as much as possible. And then now you're at the stage of being in a private sale. So clearly you've already done a lot. So I was wondering, like, what advice do you have for other founders? And like, what have you learned through the process that you wish you would have known at the beginning whenever you were first setting off on this journey? Starting Naoris Protocol?
Oh boy, that's an awesome question. Oh, let me tell you, I don't think we would have gotten out of this call by, I don't know, in 6 hours if I started going on that direction. But I think if I was going to sum all that up, um, I would say, you meet a lot of people, right? People that want to help you. It kind of like people. It reminds me of like a sorry, a Marilyn Manson song. People that want to abuse you, people that want to, there's good people, there's bad people, there's wolves on sheep's clothing, so on and so forth. So just trust your gut. That's the best thing I can say. Just trust your gut, follow your instincts, don't give up, especially if you're innovating. It's if you're going to talk to traditional businesses, it's natural that you are like in the beginning of the curve. You're right there, which is the phase where everybody says, oh, that's not even a thing, what you're saying doesn't make any sense. And then eventually everybody will be like, hey, when you're already here. And right, by the way, this space is like it's the death space. right? It's like where everything goes to die, like
The
where
valley of
hope,
death.
yeah, just hope melts around you, and eventually you already spent a lot of money and you're eating, just bread with butter. And I say, and I think, every, just reading, for example, books from Elon Musk or whatever, people living in cars and stuff, and they don't give up. So just don't give up. If you know that what you're doing has value and you believe in it, just bleed out that belief around you. Don't let, sorry for the word, F the naysayers around you, and just keep going forward. That's probably the best advice that I can give you. No hidden messages here. This is really what I would say.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like people kind of underestimate compounded efforts in the long term. So if you stick for something for 20 years, I think there's always, if you give it a good enough shot, I would say even your chances of success will be pretty much near certain. Because you can't name many people, right, that have worked hard at something for 20 years and then failed. They usually either gave up or, yeah, they either gave up early or they succeeded, right? So I guess that's how I see that.
I think that's a very good point. I mean,
Yeah.
of course, you need to manage risk in some way, right? And maybe risk for you is financial or it's emotional, or if it's your family, you have kids, whatever, and you need to provide for them, right? So all of these are, very important variables. You don't want to, be, owing money to some entity or some weird guy, right? So but having said that, if you keep on going and you don't reach that bottom where you're saying, nah, this is, I'm pivoting, then change. Or if you reach it, change. Don't fall into the gambler's fallacy. But at the same time, I want to underline, it might sound like almost opposite to what I just said before, but it's important to have these ideas, the understanding that there is a bottom. But at the same time, damn it, if you believe in it, if you really believe in it, just do it. And that's like the thing that if you don't do right now, and like I said, even if you're just living on a car, and I'm not saying for anybody to live on a car, I'm saying if that's really what you believe in and makes you happy, just do it. Because if you don't do it, you will die, you know, full of regret.
I agree.
Right?
Yeah.
And life is long, and you have your skills and they're not going anywhere, right? Even if you don't have, a job right now, you're still, you're still able to do all the things that you were able to do before. And you learned a lot through this experience. You met a lot of people, right? You went through a lot of ups and downs that hopefully made you a better, stronger version of you. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think that was great advice. And I think overall we had a super fascinating conversation about cybersecurity. We dove into so many different topics in blockchain, your past experience. And of course, we're going to leave a bunch of resources in the description about Naoris Protocol. And if people want to get involved, maybe David, if you have anything to add about how they can learn more and how people can get involved.
Oh, thank you. So besides what I mentioned before, I would say, go to our website, check out our white paper. By the way, we'll be releasing various white papers, avalanche style, in the next 2 months, focused on different areas of the project. If you would like to collaborate, participate, work with us, be a developer with us, be a partner, bring in other partners, or in any way that you think you can help, or even support the project as well in our private sale. We are open, and yeah, we have one policy in the company, which is a ZAP policy, which is zero assholes policy, and we're going to continue this policy moving forward. So yeah, we're all about positivity and making a change for the better. So that's probably what I would say. And thank you so much, Venture Note. Thank you both of you, Michael and Adrian,
No problem.
for this meeting and the time with us and the awesome questions. I really appreciated it.
Thank you so much for coming on. We'll leave other links as well in the description to DuckDAO Incubator. And also make sure to follow our other episodes on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all of the platform. Thank you so much for coming on, David, and see you all in the next episode.